The concept of true self comes actually from research done by a man named Donald Winnicott. And what he was saying was that everyone knows, when you hear that phrase, what true self is. We all know that. But what we don't know is what our true self is for some reason. Because if you ask them and say, well, what's your true self? They'll say, I don't know. I haven't the faintest idea. So in looking at that, he said the best way to look at this is to find out what is our false self. And how do we define our false self? And our false self is defined by who we became in order to survive something that happened to us as children. The true self, we decided would be the best way to find that would be to look for what gives us joy. Because when we have joy, we're really feeling full and deep and able to resolve problems with people that we might not have if we're in our false self. So I think the idea of true self is relational always. We move from ourself into relationship with another person if we can do it safely. And we have to remember that we are born in relationship with our mother. We didn't even develop without our mother. We are creatures of relationship. And our true self develops in a relationship that is open and attuned to what we need. And if our parents, for some reason, have been damaged in their own lives, they don't allow that to happen. They don't allow us to really be who we want to be. So we develop these defenses, and the false self is primarily developed to protect us. And there are defenses that people know, whether they're a defense about you're hurting and you laugh, you hurting and you withdraw, you're hurting and you get angry. All of these behaviors that put up a barrier against another human being is generally our false self. But often we don't even realize that it's not our true self. So we think of ourselves as somehow damaged and beyond repair, and we think that is our true self. And I have to keep saying to people, no, I don't think that is your true self. That is who you've become in order to survive in this particular environment. How we develop a false self out of a true self behavior is a baby reaches out with joy and interest. Alan Shore talks about the fact that when that baby reaches out with joy and interest and is thwarted, it goes from the sympathetic nervous system, which is where we get our adrenaline and our arousal state, and we're excited. And we go from that excited state into dropping into the parasympathetic, which is the state that we go to when we're resting or when we're immobilized. And so that drop feels terrible, and he calls that shame. I think if you thought about it, you could see that every one of you knows that feeling. Every one of you knows how you've smiled even at a stranger and they don't smile back, and there is a feeling in your body of dropping. And of course, there are major things much larger than that. So when the baby reaches out and the parents ignore the baby or say, leave me alone, or I'm busy, or worse things, that baby has given its true self out and been hurt in some way or another, and that hurt is remembered in what we call implicit memory. Implicit memory is one of the most important things that the brain research has come up with, because it is something that actually guides us without our being aware. The difference between explicit memory and implicit memory is clear. When you know you're remembering, you have explicit memory. And when you know you're remembering, you have a picture. So you can remember and you have the picture and you know you're remembering. Implicit memory, you just have the memory come up in your body. If when you're reaching out with joy and interest and you've been thwarted and you have plummeted down into this other place that hurts, you may forget something that happened to you when you're 8 months old or 3 years old even, that happened. But the memory implicitly is in your brain, and there it is. And the next time you're 30 years old, you're walking down the street, someone doesn't say hello to you when you smile at them, you feel it. And you don't even know why. You might even say to people, I don't know why I get my feelings hurt all the time when people don't respond to me. But the reason is because when you were very small, you had that happen. And because of that, you have that memory of the feeling of plummeting, the feeling of shame. And here it is again. So implicit memory can be of positive things or negative things. You can have something happen when you're 7, for example, that you no longer remember, but it was a wonderful surprise and a wonderful experience, but you don't remember it anymore. So implicit memories, you have to remember, is a physical feeling in your body that you do not have a visual picture for, you do not know you're remembering, and yet it impacts you. Because if it's a negative one, you move away. If it's a positive, you reach out. And sometimes you don't even know why. So the more you know about implicit memory, the more you can identify, this gives me joy because of this gives me fear because of this, and you can begin to delineate the true self from the false self, and then move towards true self experience and leaving the false self. When we have an implicit memory, we always have a bodily experience with it. Whether it's a positive, joyful, implicit memory, then we feel light and we feel able to deal with the world very well. And sometimes we use words like happy, and sometimes we use words like serene and calm. But that implicit memory, triggered by something out there in the environment, makes us feel good. We also have implicit memory for the negative things that happen to us in our life. And that feeling of hurt, that feeling of despair, that emotion that we have, shows up in our body. Whatever the physical feeling that you have, you may not know what triggered it because implicit memory doesn't give you a picture. But you have a negative feeling and you want to withdraw from that feeling. So what you do is go into one of your false self-defenses and you pull away from that person or that event, and you start developing, well, this works. I don't feel bad anymore. But we don't deal with whatever the problem was, so we become passive. And so implicit memory is so important to say, I just had this feeling. You didn't cause it. It's from my past. The more you understand that the person you're with did not cause it, it's come from your past, the more you can say, and where in my past did I get this, and what did I think about that, and what have I been doing, and I don't need to be afraid because you're a different person, that sort of thing. And all of this is important, I think, because when a parent is raising a child and they are not able to really be there for that baby in the way that the baby needs, they don't respond. What that means is the baby is putting all their energy into protecting themselves from hurt rather than the energy into developing who they really are. And when they do that, they're also changing the structure of their brain, which means that they're constantly defending rather than reaching out for life, and they are hurting their immune system, they are hurting their ability to be in the present with other people, and it really affects their ability to think cognitively as well, because all the energy is going into, I'm protecting myself, as opposed to, I'm reaching out to the world with joy. Implicit memory, understanding false self, all these things need to be delineated just so you have a structure to think with. And then you can get back to who are you truly, who do you need to be. I think this is important because I think that the more we realize that all of us have hurt, that life is difficult and that we do get hurt, and that mental illness is not necessarily uh, anything but on a continuum of different kinds of hurts. The more you see, the more you hurt, the more you defend, the less you are your true self, and therefore feeling empty or lost or angry. And if you could begin to say, all right, how do I find my true self? Go back to that as a basis for life. We would then have, I think, a whole population of people a lot happier and healthier. The more we support curiosity, learning, as opposed to making judgments about people, the healthier we'll be. And the healthier we are, the more generous we are to other people. The purpose of the True Self project is to actually follow a structure that helps you think and helps you work through who your true self is and who your false self is. And it's based on research that Bessel van der Kolk has either gone into himself or reports in his book, The Body Keeps the Score. Many of us read the book together and looked at what he said, and we came up with this idea about first the definition of a trauma. Every experience that we have that we feel like an object or are treated like an object is a trauma. And that's the definition of trauma that we're using. So finding the true self, we had to look for actually right hemisphere brain functioning. And so I've talked about that in terms of the very first step that you take is to identify your true self, find that joy, and then think in terms of a symbol. And it could actually have been poetry, and it could have been a song. It could have been anything. We chose hands-on crafts, but other people could choose any way they wanted to do. It could be cooking, either a dish that you made. But the true self symbolized, because what that is doing is helping you move from the right hemisphere of your brain, which is the holistic self, and generally the more true self, looking and moving it to symbols, which is the left hemisphere, in which you move that true self into something that you can grasp or label or handle. And then we wanted to talk about, all right, why didn't we stay with true self? And you have to look at your pain, which other people have talked about, and you look at that pain, and that's the second step. What are you most afraid of? What do you need most? And do you recognize how you've hurt yourself or been hurt in your relationships with other people? And then how would you symbolize that? So again, we're moving from right hemisphere emotional experience into left hemisphere thinking about it. And then the third step was identifying what we did to protect ourselves. So getting into the false self and knowing how to define our false self, but also symbolizing that, and finding a way to somehow label it. You hold it, and you're not as frightened by it. And then you can hold it. So we had those three steps, and then actually what Bessel said at a conference that I heard him speak, he quoted a man named Pennyback who said writing about this was very important. And I thought that again is taking all this emotion and putting it from the right hemisphere to the left, and you're integrating all this time back and forth between right and left hemisphere, opening up more neuronal passageways and really growing as you do this, but having everybody right, and that's part of the purpose of this art project. The last step is probably the most important, and that is the exhibit, because at the exhibit, every artist is showing you their true self, but they're also showing you what their true self suffered. They're being very, very open. They're reaching out with joy and interest, looking for you to support them and understand them. Because I think what we need as human beings, we need to be seen, we need to be heard, we need to be understood, and we need also to be valued for what what people understand of us. And then the last one is touch. And I think it's not just physical touch, it's touching the heart, and it's touching any part of our emotions. And that's what the exhibit is about, is we're risking a great deal. We're hoping that you will see us and hear us and understand us and value us.
I had a baby 6 years ago, and she didn't sleep. And somebody said to me, well, you know, having a baby can bring up a lot of stuff. And so she said, and there's this lady who you might want to talk to. And so I was very sleep deprived, very tired, and I called Marythelma. And so I got involved with this project because I had done therapy with Marythelma for several years, and then she retired and said, I'm going to do this art project. And so it was just sort of a seamless part of the work I had been doing to really work on myself as a mother, as a person, so that I could be a better mother. To depict my pain, I felt at a disc, and in the middle of the disc there's an object, which is a person, in a rolled up position, and to felt that, which is felting a person like that is like sculpture. You have to use a needle to work with the felt, and a form comes together. And I use the positions between sort of a child's pose of yoga and fetal position, where a human being is kind of collapsed in on themselves. And what I was thinking about was what it was like, the experience in a body of being an object. And for me, the plane of the circle is being lost in that place. When you're lost in that place of being an object, when you're treated like you're not you're just an extension of other people, then you're kind of lost. And so the larger space is the way I felt in my body, just being not seen as me, but part of this other stratosphere, which was the home I grew up in and the parents that I had. And so my pain is really about not being seen for who I am. And I think that's why the figure doesn't have a face. And that's why the figure is collapsed, because I think if the figure was being seen, the figure would be upright, would have a face, would have an open chest, would have more of a presentation to the world. And so when you're not seen, when you're sort of objectified, to me, that's the position you take as a self-protection. And so when you take that position as part of your pain, I think when you're not being seen, you do things with both your emotions and your body to be further not seen. I mean, if you're not going to be seen, why? I can remember as a child making efforts to be seen and having them sort of shamed or made fun of, or a lot of anger projected. Anger projected when I would try to be seen. And so I think you just stop trying and you go smaller and smaller. So that's the pain. And then what you do to protect that pain is your false self. Your false self is all of the things you had to do to be okay in that situation. I come from a family where my grandmother and my mother keep everything, everything, because someday you're going to use it. And I was doing that. So that's what I use those pieces to make kind of a mosaic of my false self on the outside of a box. So these pieces, just even for me, I think in my mind, wow, I saved these pieces all these years because I needed to be good and do something good and utilitarian with them. And I did. So the pieces of pot on the outside of the box are disjointed. You're not sure kind of where they're going. they leave these islands in the middle of the pieces where there's openness. To me, that represents sort of the inability to connect. I was in a bookstore in TRC, and didn't quite know what to do with my art, but I was looking through this animal book, and I got to this picture, and I started to cry in the bookstore because I knew that was my true self. I mean, the minute I saw that picture, I just thought, that's me. She's very much to me this picture of this monkey about being together, about being with, about being approachable, about being available. And this morning I asked my daughter, she was looking in the picture, in the hole in the box, and you put the light on. And I said, honey, what do you see? How does it make you feel? She thought for a minute. She said, relaxed. And to me, that's it. If you're in your true self, you feel relaxed. And if you're in your false self, you feel an enormous amount of tension, an enormous amount of anxiety, an enormous amount of anger and frustration. And if you can stop and know that you're feeling that, you will know that you're in your false self. And if you feel relaxed, you will know that you are in your true self.
Okay, so I'm in the True Self Project group because Marythelma helped me out a number of years ago, and I just recently moved back to New Mexico, and I've come into a group. Even though she's officially retired, I'm really happy that she's still helping people. I think it seems to be her true self and her real gift. And I think it's probably hard to stop doing something when you're that good at it. So I'm thankful because she's helped me put structure around a lot of pain and feelings that I've had over the years that I've really struggled with and that have weighed me down and that I didn't understand. And I felt inept, that I felt that when I found myself in really important relationships that I struggled to connect, and I didn't know why. And I didn't have the tools. And so Marythelma has helped give me some structure to that. I mean, this is definitely my journey, but to be able to have some understanding of myself and what that, to be able to put it into structure and describe my pain and who I am and why I do certain things. Because sometimes I was confounded at my own behavior. Like, why would I do that? That doesn't make any sense. And so that's what I've been working on a lot. And this is hard work. I think that this is some of the hardest work I've ever done in my life. It's so much easier for me to work 12 hours straight, or, you know, whether it's physical work or working on spreadsheets or in meetings. To me, that's much easier than this deep work about peeling out those layers and looking at myself honestly in the mirror and facing my demons. So we have this art project. We're representing our true self, our false self, and our pain. So for me, I'm going to start with my pain. A lot of it comes from, or it's based in my childhood, right? So when I think back to my mom, who tried so hard, she tried within the realm of who she is and the love that she knows. I think of her as emotionally handicapped because of the horrific things that were done to her as a child. It's hard for me to even think of what was done to her as a child. So within the framework of her pain, she tried. But I still felt unheard, I felt unimportant, and I felt like my feelings were too much. Because she didn't have the capacity to deal with my feelings. I always felt like my feelings were unsafe. So I grew up feeling like my anger and my fear and my sadness were not safe. And they're not okay. And I didn't cry very much at all until I was in my late 20s. I started finding crying and the power of it, of being vulnerable, because that's hard for me. That's my false self. So because of my pain, my false self pushes people away. That's what I do. I keep my distance. And in my artwork, what I did was I depicted my pain as the little girl inside of me that was so sad and wanted to cry and wanted to feel heard and understood and didn't, and just felt alone. And so what I did, my false self is the protector of that little girl, that I can be very hard like metal. And that's why my piece is metal, that it's the soul piercer. That's my false self. And that it worked. That part of me kept me whole in some way when I was little. And and there are times when it helps me now as an adult, but at least I have the awareness now of when I start seeing that false self come in versus my true self. So now that I can name my false self, now I can know my true self better.
So I think to really understand my project, one way to do that, it would be to go to the living room of my grandmother's house and to know the kind of pain that my mother experienced as she was growing up. Out of that pain came the pain of my childhood, and that was a house that oftentimes became empty of emotion out of my mother's woundedness. And so in that vacuum, I found two primary ways to respond. One was to escape by going outside, to play, to school, to church, some way to go beyond where there was some emotional oxygen. The other way that I found was to create emotional oxygen in the house, and so I became that kind of a creator, and took that upon myself to work hard to be that kind of person. What that meant was that oftentimes joy and spontaneity and happiness was something that I was having to contrive rather than experience. And so out of that, I developed patterns that were tended to flow around experiencing a feeling of abandonment and responding to that by a kind of collapse. And in the middle of that collapse, then I would begin to smile. And by smiling, then I could begin to create a contrived happiness or joy in my situation. That is my false self. My false self is contriving joy or happiness, and it's doing that by smiling and by sometimes furious negotiation, and always negotiating with either reality or the present or both at the same time. And it's really a pretty exhausting kind of game to play, but it's one I got very, very good at. So for me, my art project has involved learning how to express myself. And so I've started to learn pottery from a friend of mine who's mentored me in learning pottery. I'm not really good at it, but I find it's a way for me to express myself, and it's a way that I don't have to play games with. So my art really represents all three of these phases: my pain, and then my false self, which is the contrived happiness and negotiation and smiling, and then my true self. And my true self is not necessarily a perfect production, so a lot of my pottery doesn't approach perfect, but it does express the joy that I've had in making it. And the joy that I find whenever I'm able to own just my own journey and who I am and all that makes me unique. And when I find myself and I find my own voice, then I'm able to express that in life. And I express that by expressing what's in my truest heart and my truest hopes. and to express that in the midst of disappointment, and to not feel like I have to escape disappointment or contrive achievement, but just to be and to live in the moment. Part of this journey has been to identify my art and this journey with language from a genre of my own understanding, and those are the songs of Bob Dylan. And so when I think of my true self, I think of these lyrics from the song, Hey Mr. Tambourine Man. In the song, Bob Dylan speaks about being a person who has discovered that who they are and who they've been is evaporating, and that they are like sandcastles. And so he's ready to step away and to experience an alternative narrative in his life, a narrative that's represented by a Tambourine Man song. And so in that context, he steps away from the songs and the stories that have come to have no meaning into a true expression of himself. And he says in that last verse, "Take me disappearing through the smoke rings of my mind, down the foggy ruins of time, far past the frozen leaves, the haunted, frightened trees, out to the windy beach, far from the twisted reach of crazy sorrow. Yes, to dance beneath the diamond sky with one hand waving free, silhouetted by the sea, circled by the circus sands, with all memory and fate driven deep beneath the waves. Let me forget about today until tomorrow." To me, just that expression of a journey from crazy sorrow out to a beach and to dance beneath the diamond sky with one hand waving free, and to not be captured by the anxiety of the present, but just to live in this moment. And the anxiety of the present can wait until tomorrow, but right now it's a time to dance. And whenever I find myself engaged with my true self, I feel that I'm dancing. About a year ago, I wanted to celebrate my father. And so on his birthday, he died 2 years ago, and on his birthday, I had a chance to go country and western dancing. And I asked this woman to go dancing with me, and I said, "I'm not a very good dancer." And she said, "What do you mean you're not a good dancer?" I said, "Well, I'm not really good at counting the steps and staying with it." And she said, "Well, that's your problem. You don't dance with your head, you dance with your heart." And that has spoken to me about my own journey. And I just hope that somewhere in the pottery, in the song verses, in the gallery that's presented, that folks can find their hearts. And I think if we find our hearts, we'll find our way to dance.
Well, this began, actually, I knew Marythelma a while back. She was a marriage therapist for my husband and I at the time. And I started there, and that's how I met her. And then it kind of organically moved into, I had some trauma in my life, and I sustained a pretty serious injury. And it put me in a position of having to really ask who I was and what was left of myself after the injury. And it just so happens that my ex at the time left because of the injury. He flat out said, "I'm not going to wait for you to get better," and left. And so that put me in this very vulnerable, raw, open space. And so when Marythelma asked me about true self, false self, and dealing with this, it was perfect, because I was already dealing with being kind of cracked open and raw. And art is something I naturally turn to deal with these things. And so I was doing some of this recovery, some of this rewiring. I tend to be a fairly cognitive person to begin with. And so when it became a version of, we're doing this project together, and I had a chance to see other people and what they do and how they work with stuff community really made a difference for me, and so that's how it became a kind of a natural outflow of what I needed to do anyway. This version of it, every time I do something, I redo it and I look at it and it speaks to me and I talk back and forth to it, I poeticize. This particular version started out very much as a bodily sort of thing, and these all were ribs over the center. As I look at them as defense mechanisms, I look at ribs and kind of our tender organs inside, and true self as this fragile glass is of course the medium for that, because it's both bright and fragile, although sometimes it can be incredibly sturdy. Looking for your true self, resurrecting it, finding it after all these years, I feel like I'm not as coherent as some other people where you have your true self, you know what it is, it's solid, there's your defenses. For me, I'm pulling it back up. The ribs have turned into these horrible leaf things, and to me they remind me of yuccas. I'm making this nasty and awful because we are all damaged by other people's defenses when we're little, and how they don't work well with us and they end up hurting us because they've got their own problems. And then I had a friend look at this, someone dear to me, who said, oh, well, that reminds me of a dragonfly. And so he gave me a different perspective on what these things can be. So there's a lot of back and forth. I'm going to do some more work in the glass studio. These edges, all of this in the metal is burned. I have to force it into the grinder until it actually burns it. But, the alchemy of being burned, you get color, you get beauty out of it. I'll have 7 of these by the time I'm done, because Panksept has his 7 version, 7 channels that we are evolved to go through. Sometimes we're seeking, sometimes we're afraid, sometimes we're grieving, all of those. So I'm going to have 7 here. The ribs and kind of became defense mechanisms. Anna Freud had the 10, so I started with 10, but everybody has their own version, and I'm sure I use more than that. There'll be a little more glass, but it's kind of opened up, and just the poeticizing back and forth. And then I will never be done. I'm never done with anything in my house. Working in art is definitely literally working in a different part of your brain than some of this talking, because I have fun with talking about what level this is and who said this and what theory, and you have these beautiful structures of what you're thinking, but to really pull it back into your body and pull it into how you feel requires this back and forth, and requires fighting with the material. It requires having something happen and then realize, oh, I'm going to have to redo all of it. I'm going to have to make this happen. Choosing materials that are sturdy. All of it, it just is really speaking another language to me when I do this. And so, this is a language I use to speak to myself with.
I've known Marythelma for a number of years, and she had talked about doing a show with art that would be a way of us, of the group and other people, to express their true selves, their false selves, and the pain that they've suffered in their life, and show the process through a medium like art or song or poetry, whatever. So that's how I started in the group, and actually my inspiration came, you might say, 50 years ago, because I had a professor in college who said to me I was an eaglet raised with a canary's values, and that the bars of my cage were the conditioned, conventional rules and regulations, or what have you, that my family and my culture had put on me. And I remembered that for many, many years. And one day I was walking in the bosque, and I saw that somebody had created a little house out of sticks. And my little inner child said, I have to go sit inside that. And so I did, and it felt really good. So when I thought about doing a project, I thought of what my professor had told me, and I thought of what I'd experienced in the bosque, and I decided that I wanted to create a cage, a bird cage. So that's where it all started, and then it was just a matter of finding what I wanted to put in the cage and how I wanted to create it. And of course, my feeling is that we all have pain, pain is essential. Pain is not optional. Suffering is. And so in order to not stay in pain all the time, we need to get past that suffering and go on and find what really matters to us in our lives. My father passed away suddenly when I was 8.5 years old, so that has colored my relationships throughout my life. The fear of being abandoned, the fear of not doing the right thing, the fear of losing somebody or something has been a theme in my life. And through therapy and through exploration on my own, I think I've come to deal with it, and I can recognize it, so I can see it when it shows up. And that's been a real lesson for me. The cage shows my conditioned life, and the bars of the cage are there. They were put there, maybe by my culture, maybe by my parents, but I have the power to say, I don't need these bars. And so that's why my bird cage has a door that's open, and it allows for me to leave. The crystal in the center of the bird cage, I'm still kind of wrestling with whether or not it should be in there inside an egg, or if there should just be an egg. But I have a feeling that the crystal is the most important thing, because years ago I went through some therapy, and they talked about how the self, the real person inside, was like a crystal. You had to peel away the edges of the leaves of an onion, and inside was this beautiful crystal, and that was your true self. The wing on the top, I say, symbolizes my ability to fly, to be free, to escape, and to be my true self.
I was very worried about several issues of grief in my life, and I called Marythelma, and she accepted me in the group, which was a lifesaver. Even when I live in Santa Fe, I don't mind driving because it's so rich for me to come here. And I have met very, very good people, very kind people. And when I heard more about the project, I decided I wanted to join it, because I have never done anything that expresses myself, let alone the true self that I was discovering. It has been a long time in coming, and the project and making the piece helped me to coalesce all those ideas and dreams and wants that I had, and I didn't have the courage to express. So I am glad that I did this project, and it has been really fulfilling. It was good to plan it, because I have never done anything like this except collages with children when I was teaching school, preschool, and so it was fun, because even when it's like a collage on 3 dimensions, it's also an expression of what I wanted to put on the board. And it took me a long time to come up to the essence of the work. And I remember on the deadline, which was July the 15th, I had nothing. And I had all the materials, of course, and I had the main idea, but there it was. So on the 14th, I gathered it all together on my kitchen table, and I started thinking about it. And I had to start from the beginning, where I was just but a seed that grew to be the person that I am. And it was a very arduous, it was a very painful path, but slowly but surely I began to see my way out of the jail that my parents, really well-meaning, constructed around me. And I began to pick up the materials that I had spread over the table. And it was like an intuitive process. So I depicted my griefs of many, many years, and I also depicted my joys. I ended up with a symbolic flower, which is for me my true self. It's a calla lily, which is my favorite flower because inside it has so much potential. And that's how I see my true self, like with a lot of potential. Also, this project gave me the opportunity to write a poem. And I dedicated it to the two men that have died, the latest in my life, my husband and my son. And I think both would really like it, because through them I began to see that I had much more to give and that the possibilities were greater in my relationship with them. And that's why I guess the calla lily got chosen, because the possibilities are inside and ready to bloom. So that's, I think in a nutshell, how the piece got developed.
Well, I'm not an artist, so when I decided that I wanted to do an art project about my true self, false self, and my fears, I struggled with what would be the best symbol for that. And I thought of feathers, and I thought of smoke, and I thought of wind and breath, and I didn't know how in the world I would ever be able to do that. But then I realized that actually in my life, dancing has been one of the things that gave me the greatest joy. And I loved to do it, but I also love to watch it, and I love to look at beautiful bodies moving in space. And they represent freedom to me. So I learned how to paper mache, and I made myself a little dancer, and I dressed her in beautiful colors. And then I had to deal with my fears. And I made a packing case that had holes in it that would represent deep black holes, and I put sand in it that would represent, quicksand, things that I'm afraid of, things of being suffocated or close, too close. And all that comes from the fact that my defense system has been one where my false self is, I pull away from things and I stay independent and I don't make connection with others, because the great fear I've always had is if I am too close to people, I will lose my sense of self. And so that was my fear. And then the last thing I wanted was my false self, which is the screening from when you plaster a wall, they use this stuff that's screening, and I thought you could see through it, but you can't see through it. And that's how I have presented myself to the world, keeping myself safe, reaching out, pulling back, that sort of thing.